Absolute power allowed certain men to organize their environment at will, control the rhythms of their day, and choose every bite with the same precision with which they ordered military operations. Some lived surrounded by luxuries, others opted for frugality as a form of discipline. Not all of them ate the same thing, nor did they eat in the same way, but each one imposed rules at the table, a direct reflection of their way of governing. In times of war, food was not scarce for them. There were personal cooks, select menus and schedules that were respected even under bombing. Even when detained, sick or cornered, they maintained minimum rituals before the end. In cells, bunkers or destroyed houses, they did not stop eating. Some resisted trying a bite, others demanded their usual dish. Each food decision on the brink of death revealed a part of their character, of their control, of their fear or indifference. Nothing was casual, neither hunger nor gluttony. What did each one eat in their last hour, when nothing could change their destiny? Hitler in his final confinement, routine, paranoia, and a flavorless dish. Since his entry into German politics, Adolf Hitler built a figure sustained by symbols, routines, and a projection of strength. As the founder of the National Socialist Party and the main architect of the Third Reich, his rise was based on the use of discourse, the manipulation of social resentment, and the promise of restoring national greatness. In a few years, he went from being an unknown agitator to concentrating the absolute power of the state in his hands. He governed with rigidity, established a system of ideological control, and led the continent to a war that would change history. Under his command, Germany invaded Poland, France, and a large part of Eastern Europe, extending a conflict that involved dozens of nations and caused millions of deaths. Throughout the conflict, Hitler maintained a strict routine that reflected his personal discipline. He woke up late, received reports during the day, and had a late dinner. His closest circle knew his habits, which included nightly walks, long conversations, and meatless meals. The Führer avoided alcohol, did not smoke, and projected an image of self-control that contrasted with his political aggressiveness. Although he had cooks and assistants dedicated exclusively to meeting his requirements, his eating habits were not notable for luxury but for repetition. As the war progressed, the defeats on the Eastern Front and the Allied bombings weakened his control. The fall of Stalingrad marked a turning point, and the siege of Berlin in April of 1945 sealed the regime's fate. As Soviet troops approached, Hitler took refuge in the Führer bunker, an underground structure built as the last command post. He remained there for the last days of his life, surrounded by collaborators who continued to perform formal functions while the country collapsed around them. The bunker space was small, dark, and increasingly tense. Arguments increased, reports brought desperate news, and the leader of the Third Reich became more silent. His health deteriorated rapidly, his mood oscillated between anger and resignation, and his connection with reality blurred. Even so, the protocol was maintained. Meals were prepared, uniforms were cleaned, and greetings were repeated. In that environment, Hitler's relationship with food acquired a new meaning, marked by physical neglect, paranoia, and the denial of the inevitable. In the final days of the Third Reich, the Chancellery bunker in Berlin became the only scenario where Adolf Hitler maintained his routine, isolated from the outside world. While the city was reduced to rubble by the Soviet attacks, the Führer remained underground, locked in a parallel existence marked by repeated gestures, ineffective orders, and personal rituals that no longer responded to any real front. His relationship with food in those last days reflects both his physical deterioration and the sinking of the structure he had built over years. The daily lunch became an empty act. The protocol was maintained with clean tablecloths, white porcelain plates, and polished silverware, but the portions were minimal, and Hitler's interest in eating had almost completely disappeared. Only his cook, Constanze Manziali, managed to get him to try small vegetarian bites that he barely touched. The meals, which in other times were spaces for extensive conversation, were transformed into prolonged silences. The walls of the underground dining room were covered in a stillness charged with resignation. In that windowless confinement, the dictator continued to ask for tea, clear soups, and meatless dishes. His obsession with the vegetarian diet, which he had maintained as a symbol of personal discipline, was now a mechanical habit. He rejected heavy foods and ordered sweets to be removed. At times, while the roar of the artillery shook the walls, Manziali offered him a broth that he sipped without looking at anyone. The assistants knew that it was not a food whim, but a progressive decline. The food, just like power, no longer had flavor. Although the bombings intensified every hour, in the bunker the routines were still preserved. The cook appeared punctually, the valets prepared the table as if everything were still going on as normal. The shopping lists included ingredients that no one would consume. Life in that enclosure without natural light revolved around appearances, and food was part of the decor. Hitler did not eat out of hunger or for pleasure, but out of habit, as if refusing to sit at the table meant accepting that time had run out. The Führer had stopped showing interest in any conversation that did not refer to the enemy advance or the betrayals within his ranks. He no longer asked about ingredients or thanked for the dishes. During lunches, he kept his gaze down, sometimes visibly trembling, while Eva Braun and other close associates tried to maintain a false serenity. Internal tensions grew, but no one dared to break the choreography. Only the cook perceived the change. In her words, Hitler was an increasingly thin, rigid figure who barely moved and was distant from any human response. Medical reports revealed that he suffered from constant tremors, insomnia, and episodes of acute irritability. He began to suspect everyone, including those who brought him a dish. Manziali was closely watched, not out of personal distrust, but because the Führer feared being poisoned. This paranoia reinforced his isolation and further affected his diet. He only accepted food after verifying its origin, and many dishes were discarded without being tasted. The physical deterioration was accentuated. His clothes, which had been snug months before, hung loosely from his body. He walked shuffling his feet and ate in silence, as if each spoonful involved an unnecessary effort. In the midst of that environment, food had ceased to fulfill any vital function. It was only preserved by inertia. On the 30th of April, the day he ended his days, Hitler had breakfast as always, clear tea, hard bread and sugar-free jam. He was accompanied by Eva Braun and his closest assistants. The cook, although present, did not prepare anything special. There was no longer anything special to prepare. That breakfast was silent and brief. Then Hitler retired with Braun to his room. A few hours later, it all ended. The last dish served had been a cup of tea. What was once a symbol of control, order and style ended up reduced to a lukewarm drink in a collapsed underground. The disappearance of the Führer also put an end to the ceremonial apparatus that had accompanied him for more than 1 decade. The culinary rituals, the elaborate menus and the conversations at the table no longer existed. The food, which in the first years of the Reich was part of his staging as a sober and austere leader, ended in nothingness. Unwashed dishes remained, trays were not picked up, and a dining room was abandoned. After that, Manziali tried to flee along with other staff members. She was captured by Soviet soldiers, and her final fate remains unknown. Some accounts claim that she was executed, others that she disappeared in the confusion of ruined Berlin. What is certain is that the last person to prepare the dictator's food also disappeared without a trace, as if her link with the Führer's table sealed her fate. The story of Hitler and his relationship with food in his last days reflects more than the decline of a man. It shows how even the most personal habits lose their meaning when everything is lost. His last menu, as simple as his end, summarizes the fall of the one who controlled Europe with an iron fist and ended up fearing a cup of soup. Göring, power, gluttony, and the dinner that was not served. During the initial years of the National Socialist regime, Hermann Göring became one of the most influential men in Germany. A decorated war hero during the conflict of 1914, he achieved notoriety as a squadron leader and later as president of the Reichstag. His closeness to Hitler quickly placed him in the elite of the new order. Named Supreme Commander of the Luftwaffe, he accumulated power, privileges and riches that allowed him to live with an opulence unusual even in times of war. The aesthetics of his Carron Hall mansion and his fondness for stolen art were a reflection of his vision of greatness. For many, he embodied the image of the ostentatious hierarch, always with custom-designed uniforms, shiny decorations, and theatrical gestures. As the conflict advanced and defeats accumulated, his political influence waned, but he never abandoned his role as a symbol of the regime's former splendor. His fall was as abrupt as his rise, and the Nuremberg process confronted him with a reality he had never considered, being held accountable without privileges. From the beginning of the trial, Hermann Göring stood out. With a firm step and a haughty bearing, he entered the court with the same air of authority he had maintained during the regime. He occupied seat number 1 among the accused and assumed that place as if he still had some power. He showed deference to the judges, remained attentive during the statements, and took meticulous notes. It was not the behavior of a defeated man, but of someone who still intended to control the narrative of the events. On rest days, he shared a cell with other defendants, although he usually imposed himself as the dominant figure. During yard time, he walked at a slow pace, greeted politely, and spoke with ease. His presence eclipsed the others, even those who had held positions of equal or greater importance. The guards noticed how the other accused, even the most reluctant ones, paid attention to him when he spoke. Some followed him out of respect, others out of fear, but no one ignored him. With the psychologists who evaluated his mental state, he showed a collaborative attitude. He responded with precision, argued with skill, and defended his decisions with structured logic. He did not acknowledge guilt, but he also did not show denial. He said he had acted for the good of the state, of order and security. Every word was calculated. He sought to convince, to influence, to leave an impression that would survive the trial itself. During meals, a marked routine was observed. In the morning, he drank black coffee with bread and some fruit. He avoided hot breakfast, claiming he did not need it. At lunch, he chose the dishes with care. He preferred thick soups, rye bread, and meats served with boiled cabbage. He rejected desserts with refined sugar. He said that sweet things did not agree with his stomach. He used to comment that in his days at Hall, his personal cook prepared unrivaled game stews and pastries, but he did not say it with nostalgia, but as a biographical fact. Dinners were similar, although less abundant. He drank tea with bread and cold cuts. He did not usually speak while eating. Some inmates commented that at those moments he seemed concentrated on something else. He stared at the tray, chewed slowly, and rarely looked up. One of the guards noted that at times he seemed to mentally count the bites. It was not anxiety, but calculation. His way of eating had something ritualistic about it, as if he were trying to maintain control over the little he had left. As the trial progressed, international attention increased. The media published illustrations, chronicles, and comments about each defendant. In most cases, they portrayed them as dull, aged, or defeated figures. Göring, on the other hand, appeared as someone who still retained vitality. Some journalists described him as cunning, others as manipulative. His image divided opinions, but no one doubted his intelligence. That perception strengthened him, and he knew it. Towards the end of the process, the sentences began to take shape. Göring was convicted with clarity, without nuances. He knew that the outcome was decided. Even so, he maintained his composure. He did not protest, he did not beg. He returned to his cell in silence. There he requested books, paper, and a pencil. He spent hours writing. No one knew for sure what he was writing, but he seemed concentrated. Sometimes he drew plans, other times he took notes on the hearings. He said he wanted to leave an orderly testimony. In his last days, he asked for whole wheat bread, white meat, and cooked vegetables. He rejected processed foods and requested that no sweets be offered to him. He only drank water and a little tea at night. One of the officers commented that for weeks he had been keeping a small cloth bag among his belongings. It was not visible, but he knew it was there. No one suspected its contents until it was too late. The night before the sentence was carried out, he locked himself in early. He did not ask for company, nor did he make calls. He left his notes stacked, cleaned his tray with precision, and folded his clothes with care. The light in his cell went out at the usual time. The next morning he did not respond to the guard's call. Upon entering, they found him motionless, lying on the bunk with a serene expression. On the table, a letter. The doctor confirmed that his state was irreversible. The small cloth bag had disappeared. Later reports detailed that he had used a method reserved only for those who still had external connections or old privileges. No one could determine with certainty how he had managed to keep it. The fact generated discussions among the jailers, but no further investigation was made. For some, it was his last act of defiance. For others, a way to preserve his image. The authorities maintained discretion. The letter was sealed, the notes removed. Only a brief statement was allowed. In it, it was explained that prisoner number 1 would not be present at the execution. No further details were given. The other accused were transferred to the designated area. One of them asked about Göring. They were told that he would not attend. No one else spoke about the matter. In the following days, the routine returned to the court. The sentences were executed without incident. Göring's figure vanished from the records. His belongings were classified and stored. Some were destroyed, others archived. In the memory of those who observed him, the image remained of a man who, until the last moment, sought to maintain control. His way of walking, of speaking, of choosing food, of noting down every detail. Everything seemed part of a greater plan. The last gesture, silent and calculated, closed a cycle. It left no room for improvisation. Every element had been arranged beforehand. In an environment where most had lost all initiative, he maintained his own until the end. There were no witnesses, no goodbyes, only a lying body, a sealed letter, and an absence that said more than any word. Heinrich Himmler, the Reichsführer's last tea. Heinrich Himmler, one of the pillars of the Nazi regime, went from being an idealistic agricultural student to becoming the absolute head of the SS and the mastermind of the Third Reich's repressive machine. Despite having no direct military experience, he built an organization that combined ideological worship, rigid bureaucracy, and operational capability, positioning himself as a central figure in the control apparatus of Nazism. His figure projected order, efficiency, and determination, although in private he showed a peculiar sensitivity for hygiene, diet, esoteric rituals, and Germanic symbolism. During the war years, Himmler directed deportation programs, concentration camps, mass executions, and surveillance structures from the shadows, all while cultivating an image as a methodical servant of the state. In the final stages of the conflict, his influence began to erode, particularly when he secretly tried to negotiate with the Western Allies without Hitler's authorization. This maneuver was interpreted as direct treason. From that moment on, he became a marginalized figure within the Nazi circle, without support or effective power. He tried to flee in the last days of the war using a false identity, disguised as a member of a German army police unit, hoping to go unnoticed among the columns of prisoners of war. He was captured by British forces near Bremervörde after being stopped at a routine checkpoint. He was carrying documentation under the name of Heinrich Hitzinger, and his suspicious behavior led the agents to separate him from the group. During the interrogation, one of the officers noticed that he was wearing glasses similar to those of high-ranking Nazi officials, and that he had a prominent jaw like that of the Reichsführer. After several cross-references and analyses, he ended up indirectly confessing his true identity by demanding treatment as a high-ranking political prisoner. The British authorities transferred him under surveillance to Lüneburg for a more thorough evaluation. Once in custody, he was carefully searched by the British Army medical team. They stripped him completely, examined his clothes, inspected his mouth and cavities without finding anything suspicious. In a second review, a doctor detected something strange in his upper teeth. It was at that very instant that Himmler, with an abrupt movement of his jaw, released a capsule he had hidden in a small dental compartment and bit it without hesitation. He fell to the ground convulsing while foam began to come out of his mouth. The officers tried to stop him, putting their fingers in to remove the object, but it was already too late. A few minutes later, his body lay inert on the floor of the detention center. Hours before that moment, he had been offered a simple meal. According to the reports of the British agents, he was served a tray with white bread, butter, a little soft cheese, and a cup of hot tea. He did not complain or make any observations. He ate in silence, with slow movements, under the constant surveillance of the guards. It was his first and last meal as a formally identified prisoner. In those conditions, surrounded by doctors and officers without a uniform or insignia, he appeared docile and resigned. The tea was the only liquid he consumed completely, without looking at anyone, without uttering a word, as if he had already decided every step internally. During the years of Nazi heyday, Himmler was extremely rigorous with his diet. He promoted natural, often vegetarian diets and was obsessed with the internal cleanliness of the body. He rejected refined products, avoided red meats and preferred boiled vegetables. On his visits to camps, he often carried his own food in special containers, prepared by his trusted cook. He was not fond of banquets or the exuberant gastronomy of other leaders. His relationship with food was marked by a mixture of personal control and pseudo-scientific beliefs about physical and spiritual purity. On several occasions, he recommended detoxification regimens to his subordinates, convinced that internal balance determined moral strength and the fulfillment of duty. In the winter of 1943, when the Third Reich began to show signs of fracture, Himmler intensified his eating habits and adopted an even more austere diet. He only ate whole wheat bread, hot milk, cooked carrots, and occasionally unsweetened oatmeal. He considered that sugar weakened judgment. These practices, although strange to those around him, were part of his belief system. Even during meetings with high-ranking officers, he preferred to carry his own food with him rather than eat what was offered to him. His internal cell would not tolerate excesses, not even at the table. In the last days of April of 1945, upon realizing that Berlin was besieged and that his communication channels were closed, Himmler made the decision to leave the protected area. He did not leave notes or detailed explanations, but it is known that his plan was to cross to the north of Germany, approach British forces, and seek a way to negotiate personally. The operation was chaotic. He went through various safe houses, changed uniforms, got rid of his official documents, and adopted a false identity. But he kept the hidden capsule with him, prepared in advance to avoid being judged by enemy tribunals. At the time of his death, the authorities ordered his body to be buried in an unidentified location to prevent it from becoming a pilgrimage site or a symbol. The tray with remnants of bread and butter, as well as the cup of tea, were documented in the detention center's records as evidentiary items. He left no statements or final words. His last conscious choice was silent, precise, and planned. The spread bread, the sip of hot tea, the hidden capsule, and the floor of an improvised medical room sealed the end of the man who once directed millions of lives from an office in Berlin. For the British who witnessed the scene, it was a confusing and tense moment. Some tried to resuscitate him, others simply took note of the exact time and the content of the report. The attending doctor declared that nothing more could be done. The protocol was closed with the entry of his real name, the date, and the cause of death noted in clinical terms. Later images of the case show a stretcher covered by a military sheet and an empty space where one of the most powerful men of the Nazi regime had been. Joseph Goebbels, the last table of the Minister of Propaganda. Joseph Goebbels was born in Reit in Western Germany in 1897 into a working-class Catholic family. From a young age, he stood out for his intelligence and dedication to study, although a childhood illness left him with a permanent leg injury, which marked his way of walking throughout his life. He studied literature, history, and philosophy, earning a doctorate in Germanic philology. In his early years, he dedicated himself to writing and journalism, with a style marked by the intense rhetoric he would later bring to the political sphere. His entry into the National Socialist Party occurred in the mid-1920s, when he was captivated by Adolf Hitler's oratory. He soon became one of the movement's most effective propagandists, dominating radio, cinema, and the press to disseminate the regime's ideology. In 1933, he was named Minister of Propaganda of the Reich, a position from which he exercised total control over information and official culture, shaping the public narrative and reinforcing the Führer's image. During the war years, Goebbels remained one of Hitler's closest collaborators, supporting military campaigns and maintaining the morale of the population through carefully crafted messages. As the conflict advanced and defeats accumulated, his role took on an increasingly somber tone. In 1944, he assumed the position of plenipotentiary for total war, promoting extreme measures to mobilize all human and material resources. His personal life was spent with his wife Magda and their 6 children, who became part of the public image he himself projected, a model family aligned with the National Socialist cause. In April of 1945, with Soviet troops advancing on Berlin, Goebbels moved with his family to the Führer bunker, the underground shelter beneath the Reich Chancellery. There, in a small and suffocating space, he met with the last high-ranking officials of the regime to accompany Hitler in his final days. The atmosphere was charged with tension, with the constant rumbling of enemy artillery and the news of already lost cities. Despite the imminence of the collapse, Goebbels continued to work on drafting communiques and speeches, although with less and less impact outside the bunker. The daily routine in that confinement was marked by scarcity and a lack of variety in meals. Supplies came from reserves stored before the siege and were strictly rationed. Meals were served in a communal dining room with simple dishes that contrasted with the abundance of previous years. Goebbels, who had never been particularly demanding with food, accepted the limited menus without complaint, more focused on closely following every piece of news from the front. Among the foods that were served, thick soups, dark bread, some butter, and substitute coffee predominated. The atmosphere during meals was silent, interrupted only by brief comments about the military situation or by attempts at conversation that quickly faded in the face of the reality of the moment. With Hitler's death on the 30th of April, Goebbels briefly became the head of the Reich government, although in practice control over Berlin was already in the hands of the Red Army. He knew that his position was untenable, and that he had no possibility of negotiating a surrender that would avoid retaliation. Despite this, he continued to attend meetings and maintain a daily routine with his wife and children. On the 1st of May, the atmosphere in the bunker changed completely. The news that the Berlin garrison was about to surrender accelerated the final decisions. Goebbels and Magda spent much of the day with their children, while outside the explosions and shots that marked the end of the battle could be heard. In his last hours, Goebbels appeared serene and determined. He shared a meal with his wife, with a menu that, although scarce, was arranged with a certain care for that moment. On the table there was bread, some cold cuts, a few boiled potatoes, and substitute coffee. The choice did not respond to a particular taste, but to what was left available in the bunker's pantry. They ate in silence, exchanging glances more than words. Afterward, Goebbels spent some time with his children in an attempt to maintain an image of normality that would hide the gravity of what was about to happen. Contact with other members of the bunker was limited to what was essential, and their conversations revolved more around logistical provisions than emotional goodbyes. As evening fell, the couple withdrew to a secluded area of the underground complex. The staff assisting them received clear instructions not to interrupt them. The end came quickly, using means that had been prepared in advance and whose nature was discussed in whispers. Minutes later, their bodies were moved outside, where they were partially cremated near one of the bunker exits, following a procedure similar to what had been done with Hitler and Eva Braun. The improvisation and lack of fuel prevented the fire from completely consuming the remains. Joseph Goebbels went from being one of the most powerful men in the National Socialist regime to a symbol of its collapse in a matter of days. His career, marked by the manipulation of information and the construction of an official narrative, ended in a narrow, dark room with a frugal meal as the last daily act before an end that he was never willing to face at the hands of the enemy. The final scene, far from mass speeches or grandiloquent gestures, was composed of a modest table, simple food, and the silence shared with the only person with whom he decided to live that moment. Albert Speer, 20 years, prison-bred and polished memory. Albert Speer was born in Mannheim in 1905 into a well-to-do family dedicated to architecture. His childhood was spent between technical studies and a classical education, guided by his parents to continue the professional tradition. After finishing high school, he enrolled in the Technical University of Munich and then in Berlin, where he trained as an architect. In those years, still far from politics, he showed a penchant for monumental design and geometric order, elements that would later be his distinctive hallmark. His entry into the National Socialist Party in 1931 was not due to an intense ideological militancy, but to the search for employment opportunities in a context of economic crisis and lack of commissions. His technical ability and aesthetic sense quickly led him to integrate into Adolf Hitler's inner circle, who saw in him the architect capable of materializing his grandiose visions for the capital and other projects of the Reich. Speer's rise was meteoric. In a short time, he went from designing stages for party rallies to being the chief architect of Berlin and later Minister of Armaments and War Production. In that position, which he assumed in 1942 after the death of Fritz Todt, he reorganized the German war industry with an efficiency that prolonged the conflict beyond what Allied military commanders had anticipated. His methods, based on the centralization of production and the rationalization of resources, notably increased the supply of weapons, although this implied the extensive use of forced labor, including prisoners of war and deported workers from occupied territories. This aspect of his management would place him at the end of the war at the center of accusations of war crimes and crimes against humanity. In the last months of the Third Reich, Speer tried to maintain his influence over Hitler, but he also began to perceive that defeat was inevitable. During the meetings in the Chancellery bunker, his role was that of a technician who sought to prolong the resistance while privately evaluating ways to distance himself from the most extreme decisions. His relationship with other hierarchs, such as Joseph Goebbels and Martin Bormann, became increasingly tense. The discussions about the destruction of infrastructures to prevent their use by the enemy led him to disagree with Hitler, even disobeying direct orders to preserve essential resources for the civilian population. These decisions, although they partially distanced him from the most radical circle, did not erase his responsibility in the regime's labor exploitation system. With the German capitulation in May of 1945, Speer was arrested by the Allied forces. During the Nuremberg trials, he adopted a different strategy from most of his companions. He recognized the authority of the court and assumed a part of the moral responsibility for the regime's actions. Although he denied having direct knowledge of the mass extermination, he accepted that his position gave him a share of responsibility for what had happened. This stance earned him the avoidance of the death penalty, receiving instead a sentence of 20 years in prison, which he served entirely at Spandau prison. In Spandau, Speer led a life governed by prison routine. His days were spent between maintenance work, timed walks in the yard, and long hours of reading and writing. The isolation of the prison, shared only with a few other surviving Nazi hierarchs, gave him time to reflect and record his experience. This is how his diaries were born, which describe not only his role in the regime, but also daily life in prison, conversations with other inmates, and tensions with the guards. The tone of his writings oscillated between justification, introspection, and a detailed account of the last years of the Reich, with a special interest in leaving his version for posterity. In those notes, he also recounted the progressive loss of contact with the outside world. News arrived filtered by prison censorship, and visits were scarce and controlled. To pass the time, he dedicated himself to gardening and writing projects that he meticulously organized. The monotony was only broken by changes in the prison administration or inspection visits by foreign authorities. His health remained relatively stable for most of his confinement, although aging and physical limitations began to be noticed towards the end of his sentence. Speer was released in October of 1966, after serving exactly 2 decades of imprisonment. Upon leaving, he found a country transformed by post-war reconstruction and economic growth. Although many viewed him with distrust, he managed to establish a new life as a writer and lecturer, publishing his memoirs and participating in interviews where he defended his role as a technocrat, detached from the regime's most brutal decisions. This personal account, however, was questioned by historians and survivors who considered his version incomplete or biased. In his last years, Speer lived between Germany and international travel, maintaining a relatively high profile for a former Nazi hierarch. His death in 1981 during a visit to London put an end to a life marked by contradiction. A rapid rise thanks to Hitler's trust, responsibility in the war apparatus, and a prolonged confinement that allowed him to build the image of a repentant man. His diaries, published with great success, continue to be a relevant source for understanding the machinery of the Third Reich from the perspective of one of its highest officials, as well as for analyzing the complex process of personal reinterpretation that he undertook in the years after the war. Jodel, the military officer who signed the surrender. Alfred Jodel was born on the 7th of May, 1898, in Würzburg, into a Bavarian family with a military tradition. His childhood was spent in an environment marked by discipline and a sense of duty, traits that would influence the course of his life. He entered a cadet school in Munich, where he developed the skills that would lead him to excel in artillery. When the First World War broke out, he was assigned to the Western Front and participated in battles of great intensity. During the conflict, he was wounded on 2 occasions, an experience that strengthened his image as a resilient officer dedicated to the cause. After the armistice of 1918, he remained in the reduced army of the Weimar Republic, the Reichswehr, where he specialized in artillery and tactics. During the 1920s, he adapted to the restrictions imposed by the Treaty of Versailles, focusing on technical improvement and military teaching. When Adolf Hitler rose to power, Jodel had already consolidated a stable career without seeking political prominence, although over time he would become aligned with the National Socialist regime. In 1935, he was promoted to major and shortly after began to hold key positions in the General Staff. His capacity for strategic planning led him in 1938 to join the Wehrmacht Operations Office, where he participated in the design of military plans that preceded the annexations of Austria and the Sudetenland. In September of 1939, at the beginning of the Second World War, he was appointed head of the operations staff of the Armed Forces High Command, OKW, under the direct authority of Wilhelm Keitel and in close contact with Hitler. From his office in Berlin, Jodel coordinated operations on all fronts. He signed directives that authorized the war of reprisals against partisans and that hardened the treatment of Soviet prisoners. His administrative and strategic advisory role made him a key figure in the Reich's military machinery, although he rarely appeared in public. During the invasion of France in 1940, he participated in the planning of the movements that allowed the rapid German advance toward the English Channel. In the following years, he supervised the development of operations in the Soviet Union, the Mediterranean and North Africa. In the summer of 1944, Jodel was wounded in a bomb attack against Hitler at the Wolf's Lair, but he survived with minor injuries. He continued in his position until the last days of the Third Reich, when he was one of the officers who accompanied Hitler in the Berlin bunker. However, when the Soviet siege tightened, Jodel did not remain in the capital. On the 23rd of April, 1945, he received the order to move to Flensburg, where Karl Dönitz had established the provisional government. In Flensburg, Jodel became the main liaison with the Allies to coordinate the surrender. On the 7th of May, 1945, in Reims, he signed the unconditional surrender of all German forces, which came into effect the next day. For him, that act represented the end of his career and the beginning of a judicial process that would lead him to the defendant's bench in Nuremberg. Detained by British troops, he was transferred to the International Detention Centre, where he remained incommunicado for most of the time. Allied prosecutors accused him of war crimes and crimes against humanity, pointing to his signature on orders that involved the summary execution of prisoners and civilians. During the trial, Jodel tried to present himself as a soldier who had followed instructions, without the authority to disobey them. He argued that he had not participated in murders directly and that his function had been purely technical. However, the judges considered that his acts and decisions had contributed to the development of a war of extermination. In the months leading up to the sentence, his life in prison was marked by strict routines. He shared time with other high-ranking Nazi officials, including Keitel and Dönitz. He held conversations with psychologists and chaplains, reviewed his defense documents, and wrote reflections on his military career. On some occasions, he agreed to talk about his childhood and the years at the cadet school, describing the rigid environment that shaped his character. He showed no explicit remorse, but admitted that the war had ended in a disaster for Germany. The sentence was handed down on the 1st of October 1946. The court found him guilty on all charges and sentenced him to death by hanging. The execution was set for the dawn of the 16th of October. During the days that followed, Jodel received visits from his lawyer and the chaplain, and maintained limited contact with his wife, who sent him letters of support. In his cell, he reviewed notes and reread fragments of military texts, perhaps as a way of holding on to the identity that had accompanied him all his life. The night before the execution, Jodel had dinner in his cell. The menu was simple, with no luxuries or special requests: a plate of roasted meat accompanied by potatoes and vegetables, a piece of bread, butter, and coffee. There was no wine or elaborate dessert, and he ate in silence, concentrated, without talking to the guards who were watching him. He finished the meal slowly, as if he wanted to prolong every moment. Afterward, he wrote a brief farewell note that he gave to the chaplain to be passed on to his wife. In it, he did not ask for forgiveness or make political reflections, but rather thanked her for the loyalty and affection he had received. In the early hours of the 16th of October, the guards woke him up. Jodel dressed calmly, adjusted his jacket and walked toward the gallows without resisting. He climbed the steps with a firm step and, according to witnesses, kept his gaze forward. Shortly before the trap opened, he spoke a brief phrase that alluded to his loyalty to Germany. His body was buried in an undisclosed location, like that of the other executed men, to prevent it from becoming a symbolic meeting point. The figure of Alfred Jodel has been linked to the military machinery of the Third Reich and to the strategic decisions that prolonged the war. He was an officer who rose from the base to the top of the operational command, a meticulous planner whose signature appeared on decisive documents. His last meal, modest and without ceremony, perhaps reflected the tone of his last days. a silent wait before an inevitable end, marked by the condemnation of history. Höss, the commander who never saw hunger at his table. Rudolf Höss was born in the city of Baden-Baden in southwestern Germany on the 25th of November 1900. His childhood was spent in a deeply Catholic environment marked by strict family discipline, where obedience and faith held a central place. From a young age he showed a reserved personality, not inclined to social life, and with a great capacity to accept the rules imposed on him without questioning. After the First World War, in which he participated as a soldier, he returned to a disoriented and weakened country. Like many veterans, he sought a new structure to replace the lost order. He found it in the National Socialist Party, and shortly after, in the ranks of the SS, where his career would be consolidated until he became a key figure in the system of concentration camps. In his early years within the SS, Höss assumed different custodial and administrative functions. His meticulousness and his ability to apply instructions without deviating from the regulations caught the attention of his superiors. He was assigned to Dachau and later to Sachsenhausen, where he learned the methods of organization that he would later adapt in his best-known position, commander of Auschwitz. In 1940, he received the order to set up the camp, and he directed it until 1943, when he was transferred to an administrative function in the Inspectorate of Concentration Camps. He returned to Auschwitz in 1944 to supervise operations during the mass deportations from Hungary. At all times, he showed a capacity for precise planning and an absolute disinterest in the human aspects of his work. Höss's daily life in Auschwitz was marked by a strict routine. He woke up early, reviewed reports, toured facilities, and met with subordinate officers. He lived with his family in a house located a few meters from the main entrance, which allowed him to spend time with his wife and children, oblivious to the reality that was unfolding on the other side of the fences. His diet, in contrast to the hunger that the prisoners suffered, was varied and abundant. In his memoirs, he described that at the table there was no lack of meat, cold cuts, white bread and desserts prepared by cooks from the SS service. Coffee, tea and beer were regularly present, and pork and veal were frequently served, accompanied by fresh vegetables grown in nearby gardens and managed by the camp staff itself. His diet was that of a well-provisioned officer in wartime, with access to special rations assigned to the command. During his rest periods, Höss enjoyed walks with his family and dedicated time to gardening. In meetings with other officers, meals were often a time to reinforce camaraderie. Traditional German dishes such as roasts, sausages and stews were served, sometimes supplemented with products obtained preferentially thanks to the SS supply system. His diet was also a reflection of his hierarchical status. While malnutrition was the norm in the camp, he could choose from several options and eat in abundance. This difference became one of the most marked contrasts between his private life and the environment he directed. After the fall of the Third Reich, Höss tried to disappear. He was captured in 1946 after several months hidden under a false identity. His arrest was marked by a strong interrogation, during which he detailed the operation of Auschwitz and his role in the deportations and executions. In the judicial process in Poland, he admitted his responsibility and described the orders he had received and executed. During his time in prison, he wrote his memoirs, where he included references to his childhood, his training in the SS, and also details of his daily life as commander, including his diet. He acknowledged that, even in the midst of war, he never lacked basic food or quality products. In the cell, his meals were reduced to the essentials. The menu consisted mainly of bread, light soup, and small amounts of coffee or tea. Even so, compared to the prisoners of the camp he had commanded, his diet was still more nutritious. In his last days, food became a symbolic matter. He went from having a table full of options to receiving measured and simple portions. Before his execution, which took place on the 16th of April 1947 at Auschwitz, he was offered a final meal. According to the records, it consisted of a plate of meat with potatoes, white bread and coffee, a menu that was reminiscent of the usual lunches he had enjoyed during his time as an officer. It is not known whether he ate it with appetite or in silence, but it was the last time he had a dish specially prepared for him. In his writings, Höss mentioned that food, beyond its basic function, had also been an element of power. In the structure of the SS, food was part of the privileges that distinguished the command from the troops, and the latter from the prisoners. The most select products were reserved for those who held positions of responsibility, and the officer's kitchen operated independently of the troops' kitchen, with access to better ingredients and more careful service. Höss, as commander, could even receive imported food or food sent from other regions, a privilege that not all lower-ranking officers enjoyed. In family life, meals were also a moment of togetherness. His wife, Hedwig, maintained the custom of seating everyone at the table, with dishes served in the traditional way. The children ate before the adults, and family gatherings usually included a dessert, especially pies or cakes that were baked in the same house. The kitchen was well equipped, and the domestic staff took care of maintaining a constant supply. Even in the most intense periods of operations in the camp, domestic life and family meals took place normally, in an environment oblivious to what was happening outside. The transition from that environment to prison was abrupt. Höss went from having fresh bread, butter and jam for breakfast, to receiving stale bread and a light infusion. Lunches, which previously included roasted or stewed meat, became clear soups with few ingredients. Dinners stopped being family gatherings and were reduced to a piece of bread and a hot drink. On several occasions he mentioned that he did not complain about the prison food, although he admitted that it was not comparable to what he had enjoyed in freedom. The change in diet also reflected the change in his status, from a commander with privileged access to a prisoner who received what he was given. In his last writings, he did not leave emotional reflections on his diet, but he did leave practical notes, such as the times at which meals were served or the type of bread he received. His description was detailed and objective, without expressions of nostalgia. For him, food had always been one more element within order and routine. Even in his last moments, he remained faithful to that vision, accepting his last meal as part of a procedure, without granting it a declared symbolic value. The figure of Rudolf Höss continues to be one of the most representative of the concentration camp system. His capacity to organize and execute orders, his personal life parallel to the horror he administered, and the contrast between his diet and that of the victims are part of the portrait he left in his memoirs. Food in his story was not just a secondary detail, but an indicator of his position, of his disconnection with the suffering of others, and of the privileges he enjoyed until the end. From his youth until his last night, the plate in front of him reflected the place he occupied in the hierarchy, and his transition from abundance to austerity also marked the passage from absolute power to an inevitable condemnation. The dietary choices of those who occupied the highest levels of the Nazi regime were not limited to what was functional. Until the end, even under extreme conditions or while awaiting a sentence, they tried to preserve routines, tastes and gestures that had accompanied them for years. Some maintained preferences marked by their previous lives, others modified their habits under the pressure of confinement, illness or defeat. The act of eating, far from being secondary, revealed ways of facing the end: resignation, obstinacy, routine, or simply necessity. Each final meal, however modest or strange, became an expression of what they could still control when everything else had already been taken from them. The last thing that entered their bodies was not only food, but one more reflection of who they were, until the last moment.